This gang leader kidnaps the son of a wealthy man. But what happens when feelings begin to blur the lines between captor and captive? This is a story about power, tension, and a love that shouldn't exist. The kingdom of Ife was a land of stark contrast. In the bustling markets, the rich flaunted their wealth, their fine robes trailing through the dust, while the poor watched from the shadows, their stomachs empty but their spirits unbroken. Gold spoke louder than justice, and the line between wealth and poverty was so thin that even the wind dared not cross it. In the heart of this divide lived a man who walked the fine line between fear and hope, chaos and salvation. His name was Aladdin, though most knew him by another name, Ade. It was a name as soft as the morning breeze, yet whispered with the weight of a storm. Ade was no ordinary man. He didn't belong to the world of fine robes and gold, nor did he bow to the misery of the streets. He was something else entirely. A thief, yes, but also a giver. A villain to some, but a savior to many. His life was one of shadow and secrets, where every step he took challenged the power that held Ife in its grip. One morning, as the sun rose over the market, Ade stood in the shadows, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd. Merchants boasted of their wealth, their laughter echoing like coins falling into an empty jar. As one man raised a purse of gold to the sky, Ade moved silently and swiftly unnoticed. The merchant didn't feel the weight leave his hands, but the boy sitting by the roadside did. Wide-eyed, he watched as Ade pressed a single coin into his palm. Without a word, the boy whispered, "Thank you, Ade." As the merchant shouted in anger, the crowd murmured Ade's name, soft as a secret but unstoppable as the tide. Ade was here! Ade was here! Thus began the story of a man who dared to challenge the line between rich and poor, a story of Ade and a love that would change everything. Not far from the bustling market, past the high walls of privilege, lived another young man whose life was a very different one from Ade's. His name was Joe, son of the wealthiest merchant in Ife. To the world, Joe had everything: luxury, education, and status. But to Joe, his life felt like a gilded cage. He had spent years studying the world beyond the walls, trade routes, histories of empires, and philosophies of life. But books could not teach him how to bridge the gap between the rich and the poor. That knowledge lay behind his reach, in a world he could only observe from a distance. Joe's father, Oba, was a man of ambition who had built his fortune through ruthless deals, caring little for the lives crushed under the weight of his success. To Oba, Joe was not just a son, but an heir expected to carry on the legacy of wealth and power. Meanwhile, in the alleys of the poor district, whispers of Ade's plan began to spread. Ade, the shadow who stole from the rich to give to the poor, had set his sights on Oba's fortune, built on the suffering of many. Ade knew that the time had come to take it back. In the light of day, Ife seemed untouched by the storm brewing beneath its surface, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, two lives were on a collision course, one bound by duty, the other by rebellion. Joe and Ade, two men from different worlds, were about to meet in the most unexpected way. The night was still, the kind of stillness that made even the richest man uneasy. In Oba's estate, lanterns flickered, casting long shadows against high walls as guards patrolled with the confidence of men who had never known fear. They didn't expect their fortress to be breached that night. While the wealthy slept soundly in their silk-draped beds, a day moved through the darkness like a whisper carried by the wind. His gang followed closely, silent and steady. For weeks, they had studied the estate's rhythms, and tonight they struck. Ade was the first to slip through the gates, his movement as precise as a dancer. The guards never saw him coming. One by one, they fell, subdued with the skill of a man who had done this 100 times before. No blood was spilled. That was Ade's rule. Fear was a far better weapon than violence. Inside the mansion, Joe sat in his study, oblivious to the danger creeping closer. A single lantern lit the room as he pored over maps and scrolls, his thoughts far away. The door swung open, breaking the silence. Joe looked up, startled. At first, he thought it was one of the servants, but the figure that entered was someone he didn't recognize. Tall, broad-shouldered, and cloaked in the night shadows. Ade stood in the doorway, his piercing gaze looking onto Joe. "You," Ade said, his voice low but commanding. "You are coming with me." Joe rose to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest. Who are you? What do you want?" he demanded, his voice steadier than he felt. Ade stepped forward, his presence filling the room. "I am Aladdin, aka Ade," he said boldly, "and I am here to kidnap you for ransom." For a moment, Joe's eyes widened in recognition. He had never seen Ade before, but the name was one he had heard countless times. Whispers in the halls of the rich and stories told by those who had felt the sting of Ade's raids. Ade was the most feared and talked about man in the kingdom, though few had ever seen the notorious gang leader. Panic gripped Joe's heart, but he forced himself to swallow it. He wasn't a man who gave in easily, so he straightened his back and said, "Well, let's get this over with." Ade's lip twitched into a faint smirk. "Brave," he muttered, "but foolish." He gestured to his men, who entered the room and quickly bound Joe's hands. As they led him out into the night, the chill of the air beat at his skin. The estate, once a place of comfort and safety, now seemed cold and unfamiliar. For the first time in his life, Joe felt utterly powerless. Ade walked ahead, his stride purposeful, his mind focused on the task. Joe was just another pawn in his game against the rich, but as the young man's footsteps echoed behind him, Joe couldn't help but glance back just once. The look in Joe's eyes, confused, angry, and proud, stayed with him longer than he cared to admit. The journey to Ade's hideout was long, and as they walked through narrow alleys and hidden paths, Joe's mind raced with questions. When they finally arrived, Joe was struck by the starkness of the place. The hideout was no grand fortress, but a repurposed warehouse on the edge of the poor district. Its walls were withered and cracked, and its corners were lit by dim lanterns. A fire burned in the center, throwing flickering shadows on the faces of Ade's gang. They were young, scrappy, and dangerous looking, but their eyes held something more than maintenance, something closer to loyalty. Joe was pushed forward and forced into a chair. He glanced up at Ade, whose sharp eyes seemed to pierce through him. There was no kindness in Ade's gaze, but there was no malice either, only curiosity. "You are quiet," Ade said, leaning against the table with casual authority. I expected more fights from the son of Oba. John straightened his back, refusing to look away. "I have nothing to say to a thief." The gang chuckled, but Ade's expression didn't change. Instead, he tilted his head as if considering something. "A thief?" he repeated. "A thief?" His tone laced with mockery. "Tell me, Joe, where do you think your father's wealth comes from?" Joe's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Ade took a step closer. "You sit here in your fine clothes, fed by the labor of people who can barely afford bread, and you call me a thief?" Though there was no humor in it. "If I'm a thief, then your father is a king among criminals." The words stung, not because Joe believed them, but because they forced him to confront a thought he had spent years trying to ignore. He looked away, his silence ending another round of chuckles from the gang. Ade waved a hand. "Leave him, we will deal with him in the morning." As the gang dispersed, Ade lingered for a moment, his eyes still on Joe. Then, with a shrug, he turned and walked away. Joe exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly now that Ade's piercing gaze was gone. He looked around the room, searching for an escape route, but the doors were guarded and the windows were too high to reach. He leaned back in the chair, his mind racing. Had his father been alerted to his kidnapping? How long will he be kept here? How long until he could return home if they ever let him go? In the far corner of the room, Ade sat by the fire, sharpening a blade. He didn't look at Joe, but the merchant's son stayed in his peripheral vision. Joe was different from anyone Ade had ever encountered. He was proud, defiant, and unshaken by the power Ade wielded over him. And yet, there was a vulnerability in his eyes that Ade couldn't quite place. Neither man slept that night, though neither would admit it. One stared at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the chaos he had been thrown into, while the other watched. The fire flickered, waiting for whatever came next. Night was long, but the dawn brought a new challenge, one neither Ade nor Joe could predict. And so, the battle for the soul of Ife continued. Thank you so much for subscribing. Thank you so much for staying till the end. If you didn't subscribe, please do well to subscribe and click on the notification bell so that you are aware when next I'll be posting my next story. And till next time, I say I love you and bye.
A gang leader, ruthless and cold, kidnapped the son of a wealthy, powerful man. But what if this is more than just about the ransom? What if it's about something deeper, something far more personal than anyone could have imagined? This isn't just a kidnapping, it's a game where the stakes are far higher than you think. Why him? Why Joe? The question burns in everyone's mind. Was it just about money, or does it run deeper, entwining them in a tangled web of revenge, ambition, and betrayal? Hold tight, because this story will challenge everything you thought you knew about power, wealth, and survival. The fire flickered in the dim hideout, casting shadows that seemed to stretch like grasping hands along the walls. Joe, heir to a vast fortune, was no longer a man of privilege but a prisoner, caught in the web of a ruthless gang. Bound by ropes, his body aching from the strain, and surrounded by men who answered to one name, Ode. The gang leader, feared, revered, and utterly dangerous, had done more than just kidnap him. Joe felt it deep within him, this was never just about the money. There was something dark and personal at play. Something with his name on it. Joe, still trying to piece together the fragments of his situation, clenched his fist. He was supposed to be the one in control, the one who commanded respect and influence. But now, here he was, sitting in the dirt, an unwelcome guest in the dimly lit den of Ode and his gang. The glint of steel from a sharpened blade caught his eye. Ode. The name echoed in Joe's mind like a sinister drumbeat. But it wasn't just the blade that unsettled him, it was Ode himself. There was something about him. Cold. Calculating. There was a chilling depth behind his eyes that kept Joe on edge, a presence that made him feel small and vulnerable despite his wealth. Every move Ode made was calculated, deliberate. His hands moved with practiced ease, the rhythmic sound of sharpening steel punctuating the silence that wrapped around them. Joe watched, trying to control his growing unease. His chest tightened, the air thick with the stench of danger. "What do you want from me?" he finally spat, his voice trembling despite his attempt at bravado. Ade's eyes flicked up, locking with Joe's. The faintest smirk curled at the edge of his lips, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're a terrible liar." Joe's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't realized how intensely he'd been watching Ode, but now that it was out, he couldn't shake the uncomfortable feeling in his gut. Something about this man, this beast, stirred something in him. Was it fear? Was it respect? Or was it something far darker? "You're not like them," Ode said, his voice cold, dismissive. "Like who?" Joe shot back, trying to maintain his cool. The game was shifting, and Joe knew it. The others. The ones who beg, who cry, who offer their freedom for a few coins. Ade's gaze never wavered. "But you? You act like you're still in control." "I am in control," Joe snapped, though the conviction in his voice was already wavering. Ade's smile faded, and his eyes darkened. "We'll see how long that lasts," he murmured, his voice low and threatening. The words hung in the air like a challenge, or a promise. Joe couldn't tell which, but his gut told him it was something worthy. His mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. Days had blurred together. The sound of coins shifting in the hideout, the low hum of the gang preparing for their next move, it was all part of something bigger. Something Joe couldn't quite grasp. The ransom demands had been made. His father, the great tycoon, the man who controlled half the city's wealth, had refused to pay. Joe couldn't believe it. Was his father really this proud? This cold? Was it pride that kept him from paying, or was there something deeper at play? As the days wore on, the tension between them grew. Ode, for reasons Joe couldn't fathom, never grew impatient. He was calm, composed, and cruel in his restraint. But even Ode couldn't keep the darkness inside him at bay forever. One day, Ode broke the silence. "You don't sit still very well, do you?" Joe stiffened, meeting his gaze with defiance. "Maybe I don't like being caged." Ade's eyes flickered, and for a moment, there was something more than the usual icy detachment. It was a glimpse of something broken, something real. A cage. He chuckled softly, the sound almost cruel. "You've been here 3 days, and you call this a cage? Try living in a place where the walls keep you trapped. Where there's no way out, no light." The word struck Joe harder than he expected. Was this how Ode saw the world? Was that why he had become this monster? Joe wasn't sure he wanted to know. But the darkness in Ade's eyes told a story Joe wasn't ready to hear, but couldn't ignore. Joe's voice faltered, but he pushed back. "So, what? You became a criminal?" Ade's eyes narrowed, his expression darkening further. "We all run from something, Joe. Some of us just don't pretend otherwise." The words hung between them, thick with meaning, thick with something Joe couldn't quite comprehend. The gang's movements were shifting, their plans becoming more chaotic, more desperate. Ade's quiet control began to unravel. There were whispers now, whispers about a plan, one that wasn't just about money. The tension in the hideout grew heavier by the day, a palpable pressure that made it hard to breathe. Joe's mind raced. He was no longer just a pawn in this game. Was he something more? Or was he simply the tool Ode needed to exact revenge, to finish what had been started long ago? Days turned into a blur of claustrophobic moments and fleeting conversations. As the walls closed in, Joe knew something big was coming, but he couldn't piece it all together. His father's silence gnawed at him. There was something deeper at play here, something more than just money. Then, the truth came to light. Joe had always thought his father was a man of ruthless business decisions, of iron fist and cold eyes. But when he learned the truth, the real reason behind his kidnapping, he couldn't believe it. His father wasn't just a businessman. He wasn't just a tycoon. He was tied to Eight's past in ways Joe never could have imagined. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about power. It was about revenge. And Joe, whether he liked it or not, was caught right in the middle. The tension in the hideout hit a boiling point as the gang prepared for their next move. Joe, still bound, felt the weight of the situation pressing in on him. But he wasn't just a hostage anymore. Not in his mind. His future and Eight's were bound together in ways neither of them could have predicted. And as they slipped into the shadows, the question burned at the back of Joe's mind: would he escape this alive? Or would their fates, tangled in a web of betrayal, greed, and revenge, destroy them both? The answers were closer than Joe realized. But the real question was, who would break first? Would Joe's will to survive overcome the horrors lurking in the dark? Or would Eight's dangerous past swallow them both whole? This story is far from over. You've only seen the tip of the iceberg, and the real twists are yet to come. Stay tuned for part 3, because you won't believe what's coming next. Secrets will be revealed. Loyalties will be tested. And no one will be left unscathed. Subscribe now and turn on notifications. This is one story you don't want to miss. The game is just beginning. Thanks for staying tuned till now. To all my returning subscribers, you're the best, and to my new subscribers, I love you, and until next time on the part 3, bye bye. A dangerous gang leader kidnaps the son of a wealthy man, but what happens when feelings start to blur the lines between captor and captive? What would you do if the life you knew was torn away in an instant? Would you fight for your freedom, or would you begin to question everything you've ever known? Can you ever truly escape the person who's holding you hostage, or will the lines between captor and captive blur forever? This isn't just a story about a ransom, it's about power, tension, and a love that shouldn't exist. The night is darker, the stakes higher, and the danger more real than ever. Joe's life has been turned upside down, and now he's facing a conflict unlike anything he could have imagined. Will he return to the life of wealth and security that he once knew? Or will the man who holds him captive change everything? In the grand hall of his estate, Joe's father, Ma, stood surrounded by his wealthiest allies. The room was opulent, its walls lined with gold-trimmed tapestries, and its floor polished to a mirror-like sheen. But despite the luxurious surroundings, the tension in the room was unmistakable. Mba paced back and forth, his mind heavy with the news of his son's kidnapping at the hands of the notorious Ode. Word had spread quickly, and his wealthiest allies gathered to discuss their next steps. "I will not bow to a thief," Ma declared sharply, his tone cutting through the tension like a knife. "Ode, whatever they call him, thinks he can humiliate me. He thinks he can take what's mine and get away with it. But I refuse to give him a single coin." His voice shook with a mix of anger and pride. What message does that send? That thieves can do whatever they want. That we, the wealthiest men in this kingdom, are weak. One of his allies, a rotund man with graying hair, raised a hand cautiously. His voice was measured. "But Mba," he began, "the authorities have been chasing Ode for years. The people love him. They hide him, protect him. How do you plan to succeed where they failed? And what of your son? Are you not concerned for his safety? He is your only heir." Mba's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with disdain. "He will not hurt my son. Joe is currency. I believe Ode isn't foolish enough to destroy something so valuable." He paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. "And besides, I'm not counting on the people's loyalty. I've stationed men throughout the kingdom, people with no ties to Ode. Men who will do whatever it takes to bring my son back. I'll pay anyone else, but I will not give that rat a single coin." The ally pressed again, his tone incredulous. So it's not even about the money. You'd rather pay strangers than pay the ransom and ensure your son's safety. It's about principle. Ba snapped. This is about sending a message. Ade is a disease, a parasite on this kingdom. He pretends to help the poor, but all he does is sow chaos. If I give in to him, it only encourages more of his kind. The room fell into a tense silence, the murmurs of the allies subdued under the weight of Mba's conviction. But the graying man shook his head, his expression skeptical. And yet, he said slowly, the people would die before they give him up. Do you think your men can succeed where entire armies have failed? Mba stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing dangerously. They'll succeed, he said, his voice adamant. Because they know what's at stake. I burned this kingdom down before I let Ode win. His allies exchanged uneasy glances, their doubts unspoken but evident. Yet Mba remained resolute, his hatred for Ode burning brighter than any concern for his son. Evening had settled over the poor district. The light faded into a soft dusky glow, and the streets, usually alive with the hum of trade and chatter, were quieter than usual. Ode and his gang remained hidden in their new hideout, their ears tuned to every sound beyond the thick walls. Joe sat near a small window, watching the flicker of torchlight in the distance. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of something inevitable pressing down on them all. It wasn't fear that gripped him, but a growing unease, a realization that the world he thought he understood was far more complex than he ever imagined. "They're here," one of the gang members whispered, peeking through a crack in the door. Ode, seated at the table with a blade in his hand, didn't look up. His focus remained on the knife, the rhythmic motion of sharpening it steady and deliberate. "Let them come," Ode said calmly, his voice a quiet threat. "They won't find what they are looking for." Joe turned to him, frustration bubbling to the surface. "How can you be so sure?" he asked, his tone harsher than he planned. Ode glanced at him, his gaze hardening. "Because this isn't the first time," he replied simply. "And it won't be the last." The sounds of the raid grew louder outside, boots thudding against cobblestones, voices shouting orders. Joe leaned closer to the window, his heart pounding as he saw the guards moving through the streets, their torches lighting up doorways and alleys. But what struck him most was the reaction of the people. The poor district didn't scatter in fear or cower in silence. Instead, they moved with quiet purpose, some creating diversions to lead the guards astray, others standing firm and refusing to speak. A group of women began shouting at the guards, accusing them of harassing innocent people while the real criminals went free. The guards hesitated, unsure whether to push back or move on. "They're protecting you," Joe murmured, his voice tinged with disbelief. "All these people, they're risking everything for you." Ode didn't respond immediately. He stood and moved to the window, his gaze fixed on the scene below. "They're not protecting me," he said quietly. "They're protecting themselves, their families, their way of life." Joe turned to him, his chest tightening with a mix of guilt and admiration. "But why?" he asked. "Why would they go this far for you?" Ode met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "Because I do what your father and his kind never will," he said. "I give them hope." The words hung in the air, quiet but powerful. Joe looked back at the street, his mind racing as he watched the people outwit the guards at every turn. For the first time, he felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name, a mix of shame for the world he came from, and awe for the resilience of the one he was now seeing. The raid dragged on into the night, but the guards left empty-handed. As the last torch disappeared into the distance, a quiet cheer rippled through the district, carried by those who had stood their ground. Ode stepped away from the window, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "And that," he said, turning back to the room, "is why Mba will never win." Joe said nothing. His thoughts were too tangled to unravel. He sat back against the wall, his gaze lingering on Ode. He didn't understand the man, not fully, but for the first time, he wasn't sure he wanted to leave. The next day, Ade's patience began to wear thin. Mba's refusal to pay the ransom had stretched the situation too far, and Ode was growing increasingly frustrated. He paced the hideout, his sharp eyes flicking over to Joe every so often, who sat in the corner with his head bowed. This needs to end, Ode muttered mostly to himself. He stopped in front of Joe, his gaze cold and focused. Your father's games have gone on long enough. I think it's time I remind him exactly who I am. Joe looked up at him, confusion flooding his features. What do you mean? He asked, his voice tight with apprehension. Ode didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached down to the table where his knife lay. He picked it up, inspecting the blade with careful precision, his fingers tracing the edge. Joe's heart rate quickened as he watched its every movement. The air in the room grew denser, charged with silent tension. Ode, Joe said, his voice trembling slightly. What are you going to do? Ode finally turned to Joe, his expression impassive. I'm going to give your father a message he can't ignore, he sighed. He wants proof that I'm serious. I assure him. Joe's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced with the implications of 8 words. His chest tightened as he realized what Ode was about to do. No, Joe said urgently, his voice cracking. You can't. But it was too late. Ode stepped closer to him, the knife gleaming ominously in his hand. You don't understand, Ode said, his voice low and steady. Mba won't take me seriously until he sees I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Joe's eyes widened in horror as he scrambled to his feet, backing away from Ode. Please, no, he begged, his voice breaking. Don't do this. Ode moved quickly, grabbing Joe's wrist before he could escape. I'm sorry, he said, his voice soft but firm. This is the only way to make Ma understand. Joe's heart raced, panic surging through him as Ode brought the knife closer to his hand. I thought you, Joe's voice faltered. I thought we. How could you do this? His words reached Ode, and for a moment, Ade's hand faltered. He looked into Joe's eyes, his expression unreadable. For the briefest moment, there was a spark of hesitation. But it passed quickly, and Ode set his jaw, still in his resolve. Joe squeezed his eyes shut, his hands trembling as he tried to pull away. Please, he whispered. The knife pressed against Joe's hand, and he flinched, tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. The room fell into an eerie silence as he braced himself for the pain there. His mind was a blur. He had thought for a brief moment that Ode might actually care for him. How wrong he had been. Later that day, a messenger appeared at Mba's estate, breathless and pale, holding a small blood-stained parcel. The contents, carefully wrapped, were delivered into Mba's hands. He opened the box, and his eyes widened at the sight of the severed finger. The letter accompanying the finger was short, its message clear, * your son's safety depends on your decision. Pay the ransom before it's too late, *. Mba's face drained of color as he stared at the gruesome token, the weight of the primal fear. He had to act. Mba's hand trembled as he picked up the finger, the magnitude of what was at stake finally hitting him. He turned to his men. Prepare the ransom, he ordered, his eyes cold with fury. I will not lose my son. The night was colder than usual as Ode prepared for the exchange. The quiet hum of the gang's activity filled the hideout, but there was a palpable tension in the air. Everything hinged on this moment, Joe's future, Ade's plans, and Mba's reluctant decision to meet the ransom demand. Joe sat by the window, staring out into the darkness. His mind was a whirl of confusion and emotion. He had spent the past few hours trying to make sense of everything. Part of him longed for the security of returning home, the life he had once known, but another part of him, the part he didn't fully understand, feared the empty, transactional world waiting for him. He wasn't sure where he belonged anymore. What troubled Joe even more was what had happened earlier that day, rather, what had almost happened. Just as Ode had been about to sever his hand, Joe had heard him curse under his breath, muttering, I can't do this, before stepping back. Ode had seemed to carry a weight in that moment, something Joe couldn't place. When Joe had tried to speak, relieved that his hand was still intact, Ode had silenced him with a raised hand before turning away. Since then, Ode hadn't spoken a word to him, completely avoiding him. Joe had only learned of the deal with his father from what little he overheard. Ode wouldn't say a thing. Now, Standing before the table preparing the ransom, Aid's movements were swift, mechanical, his hands moving as if unaffected by the gravity of the moment. But Joe could sense something beneath the surface. His shoulders were tense, his jaw tight. Ode wasn't as calm as he seemed. Joe stood up, his legs stiff from sitting too long, and his heart still racing from the lingering tension of earlier. He took a hesitant step toward Ode, his voice quieter than he intended. "Why did you stop earlier? Why didn't you go through with it?" Ode exhaled slowly but refused to meet Joe's eyes. "You're going back. You're going back to your father," he said, his tone flat. "That's all that matters." Joe's heart sank. He had no idea what he had expected Ode to say, but though he knew he should feel relief that his father had finally agreed to pay the ransom, that he would soon be returning home, the moment didn't feel like the relief he had imagined. There was something about Ode, something about this place, that made him hesitate. Ode finally turned to face Joe, but his gaze was cold. His eyes stripped of any warmth. "Get ready," he said, his voice final. "We don't have time to waste." Joe nodded, masking the hurt that settled deep inside him. Moments later, he followed Ode and his gang through the darkened alleys, each step taking him closer to the world he had once known, and farther away from the man who had completely changed his worldview. Stay tuned for part 4, where the tension reaches its peak, and all the secrets you've been waiting for will finally be revealed. Will Joe make the ultimate choice? Can Ode be trusted? You won't believe what happens next, ***. Thank you so much for staying tuned. Do well to turn on the notification bell so you are aware when next I'll be posting the next story. To all my subscribers, I love you, and to my returning subscribers, you're the best, and until next time. Bye-bye.
What happens when the captor and the captive start to feel the heat of an undeniable attraction? When the lines between power and vulnerability blur, can love truly conquer all? Are these two destined for more than just a dangerous game? Stay with me as this love story teeters on the edge of passion and betrayal. The fire is starting to burn, but who will get consumed? The grand hall of M's estate gleamed under the soft glow of countless lanterns. Their flickering light cast a warm, golden hue over the entire room. Gold-trimmed drapes cascaded down the high walls, and polished marble floors reflected the opulence of the evening's festivities. But for Joe, the son of the powerful merchant, all this luxury felt like a gilded cage. The laughter of the kingdom's elite echoed around him, but it felt hollow, an empty sound in a room full of strangers. Joe leaned back in his chair, staring vacantly at the high windows. His gaze seemed to search for something beyond the walls, perhaps freedom, or an escape from this suffocating life of privilege. He had been raised to inherit everything, the estate, the wealth, the power, but none of it ever felt like his. Wealth had come at a price, and it was a price Joe hadn't asked for. His peers around him laughed and boasted about their exotic travels, their family's power, and their endless business ventures. Joe, however, couldn't shake the feeling that his life was already written out for him. He wasn't the master of his own fate. He was just the heir to a fortune that was never really his to claim. But what if there was a way out? What if there was a chance for something real? Unbeknownst to Joe, another pair of eyes observed him from the shadows. Aid, disguised as a humble caterer, stood near the edge of the room. Dressed in a modest white outfit and a headscarf, he blended seamlessly with the other servants. His presence was almost invisible, but his calculating gaze told a different story. He wasn't here to serve the guests. He was here for something far more dangerous. The plan had been carefully orchestrated. Joe's father, Umar, had fortified the estate, increasing the number of guards and tightening security since their last attempt. Joe had become nearly untouchable, but Ade and his gang were ready. Disguising themselves as caterers was the only way to get inside undetected. The laughter reached its peak, and that was when Ade made his move. He set his tray down with deliberate care and signaled to his gang. The trap had been set. Smoke bombs hissed, filling the room with thick clouds of confusion. Guests screamed, and the clash of steel filled the air as guards scrambled to regain control. But it was too late. Ade moved swiftly through the smoke, his gang moving with military precision. They intercepted guards, creating diversions, ensuring a swift and clear exit. Aid's target was clear, Joe. Through the haze, Joe blinked in confusion, his eyes widening as Aid appeared before him. "Let's go," Aid muttered, his voice low but firm, gripping Joe's arm. Joe barely had time to react. Before he could protest, Aid yanked him to his feet and pulled him toward the exit. Behind them, Umar's voice thundered through the smoke. "Stop him! Don't let him take my son!" But it was too late. The gang expertly guided Aid and Joe through the estate, moving fluidly as they scaled walls and dashed through alleys, leaving the chaos behind them. The sounds of Umar's frantic shouts faded as they escaped into the quieter streets of the district. As they paused near an alley, the weight of what had just happened settled heavily between them. Joe turned to Aid, his expression one of exasperation and disbelief. "All that drama?" Joe asked, his voice sharp but tinged with disbelief. "You could have just asked if you wanted to see me that badly." Aid shot him a sidelong glance, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Where's the fun in that?" Joe stared at him, caught off guard by the answer. A rush of emotion stirred inside him. Was he amused, annoyed, or maybe something else entirely? For the first time, Joe felt the attraction he had tried to deny. The attraction to the outlaw, his captor, his enemy, was undeniable. The heat between them simmered, thick and palpable. Neither could ignore it. The hideout was eerily quiet. The chaos of the kidnapping had faded, leaving an unsettling stillness in its wake. Joe stood near the edge of the room, arms folded across his chest. His radiant skin caught the dim firelight, but his face remained unreadable. His eyes, however, never left Aid. They were alone now. The weight of their shared history, the kidnapping, and the unspoken tension between them filled the room. It hung there, thick in the air, undeniable. "So, what do you want this time?" Joe's voice broke the silence, calm but edged with disbelief. Aid, arms crossed, studied him closely. "I need you," he said slowly, his voice laced with quiet intensity. "I need you to help me invest the ransom money, to create something lasting for the people here. They deserve more than coins that run out after a few months. I thought you'd know how." Joe blinked, his brow furrowing. "You kidnapped me? For that?" Aid's voice sharpened. "You're the only one I know who understands this. You said it yourself the last time you were here, that you love economics and strategy. So I thought, I'm not asking for a favor, Joe. I'm giving you a purpose." Joe's heart hammered in his chest. Was this some twisted game, or was there something deeper at play? "Fine," Joe said, his voice softer, but uncertainty lingering. "I'll help you, but under 2 conditions." Aid raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What conditions?" Joe held up one finger. "First, since you clearly missed me so much, you had to steal me from my home. Twice." "I didn't miss you," he said, but before Aid could speak, Joe silenced him with a raised hand. "I'm not done talking." Aid's composure faltered for just a second. Joe continued, "I'm going to take you on a date." The words hung in the air, heavy with implications. Aid blinked. "What?" Joe smiled, slow and deliberate, stepping closer. "A date. 2 people talking, getting to know each other. Maybe sharing a meal, candlelight, stolen glances, all of that." Aid's breath caught. For a moment, the world around them seemed to shrink. But then, with a smirk, Aid raised a second finger. "Second condition," Joe said. "I want better living conditions than last time. That chair's not going to cut it. I'll need your bed." Aid blinked, his face flushing. "What, my bed?" Joe shrugged innocently. "It's the only comfortable one here, right? Unless you want to share it with me." Aid's mouth opened, then closed. He didn't know how to respond. His mind raced, but his heart was betraying him. There was a warmth spreading through him, something that made him feel vulnerable in a way he'd never known before. "I'm impossible," Aid muttered under his breath, his usual composure slipping. Will Joe and Aid finally give in to their growing attraction, or will their dangerous lives tear them apart? What happens when love collides with power? Don't miss the next part of this thrilling story. Subscribe, like, comment, and share. Stay tuned because the storm is only beginning. Thank you for staying tuned till now. For all my returning subscribers, you know I love you, and to my new subscribers, you're the best. Turn on the post notification bell so you're alerted when the next video drops. And until next time, bye-bye.